Well, there's something very interesting happening in the vibe coding community at the moment, which is an emphasis on security, believe it or not. So, with the emphasis on security, one of the aspects I want to talk about today is RLS, or row-level security. What is row-level security? Essentially, what row-level security is, in a nutshell, is the ability to be able to conveniently access data from the browser. Now, why do I say conveniently access data from the browser? Because there's two methods to do so. One is through anon, right, which is through the anonymous requests, which is a role inside the Postgres. And then the other one is through auth.uid, which are the specific examples in the Supabase documentation. So what does it mean to somebody who is a founder creating these vibe-coded applications? It means that you're probably using RLS correctly, assuming that it's on. But I know that LLMs have a bit of a weird time with RLS. And they have this tendency to turn them off to just try to get different features to work inside of the database. That is problematic. Why is it problematic? Because there are certain things that you can do within the database itself in order to mitigate the different ways in which people access data. One of which is to control the schema. The schema itself can be public or private. It depends on what you're doing with your application and what you want out of that application. Now you may be saying to me, Danny, well, what do you mean? Like, you know, my application is public. Well, that means your schema is public. But what is behind the application? Maybe you have an administration portal. Now, if you have an administration portal which is accessible through the browser, think about it this way. Would you rather have somebody like me, right, an attacker, change an ID within the permalink to gain access to your administration dashboard because authentication was not a thing? Because if the answer is yes, you probably want to look into this video. And I'll tell you why that's a really bad idea. So, basically the reason why that's a bad idea is because now I have admin access to your entire application. I've compromised your application due to a lapse in security. Now, if you're a vibe-coded founder, CEO person watching this video, right, I have some good news for you. There are mitigations. Right, so what do we do in the software community when stuff like this happens? We do something called RCA, or root cause analysis. Now, if I look at the Supabase documentation, which is what a lot of vibe coders are using at this point in time, what it states is very simple. What you need to do is run this command. It's called enable row-level security. Right? You can run this in Postgres. In Supabase, it's on by default. But you got to remember that certain policies need to be enacted for certain pages. For example, you can have a policy which states, right, I'll create a table for my administrators as long as they authenticate using something like JSON Web Tokens or via an ID within my table, right? In other words, I look for the attribute called user ID within my table, an attribute called UID in my auth table, then I can set that to being equal to user ID. Now, if that happens, that means I'm authenticating based upon the identification number and assuming that they're equal. That is a good mitigation method. Why? Because it means that people have to be authenticated to see certain areas of my application. Good security. But it does have its downsides. For example, the JSON Web Token, right? You can do something called auth.jwt, and you can find it within the Supabase documentation. Now, an LLM, right, like Claude or OpenAI, may mitigate some of these features. Why? Because it's convenient. It's as simple as that. It's easier to ship. But here's the thing. If you use JSON Web Token for something like API level access to your application, you have to make sure that it fits within a 4096 byte window for a browser. 4096 byte window for a browser. If it goes or exceeds that, right, you run into problems whereby buffer overflow attacks can happen. Now I overflow the memory to retrieve that JSON Web Token, and if that session persists, I gain access to your application, assuming that I know the username, that I know the parameters for authentication. Because yes, you have authentication enabled, but at the end of the day, you haven't managed the memory. You haven't managed the memory. So what do we do about this? Well, we make sure auth.jwt, when we're authenticating into the application, is less than 4096 bytes. And on top of that, we have to make sure that each JWT for each session is fresh. It's a fresh authentication session because we don't want it to linger when we're authenticating. Why is that important? Because if we cache that JWT token, it means that whatever the time window is, right, be it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, I can use that same token to authenticate on a different machine. Now, you may not necessarily want that for your application. Why? Because if that happens, it means that you won't know where the attacker has come from, making what's called root cause analysis very difficult to do. Because it may look like a valid JWT that was issued, because it is a valid JWT or JSON Web Token. That's what it means for your security. So what do we do about that? Well, again, we use policies, right? We use policies. But I want to talk about two different things here, right? I talked about JWT and I talked about auth.uid. But there's a certain shortfall in it. And here's one from the examples. So we can run into a situation where auth.userid returns null when unauthenticated. When a request is made without an authenticated user, in other words, the no access token or the session has expired, auth.uid returns null. This means that a policy like using, right? Using is just an attribute. We just use that to say, right, what do we want the SQL command to do? So it says using auth, which is our table, uid, which is our attribute, is equal to the user ID. It will silently fail for unauthenticated users because null equals user ID. Okay? Null equals user ID. Because it's always false in SQL. To avoid confusion, make sure your intention is clear. Recommended an explicit check for authentication. So in other words, using auth.uid, so using the same, is not null, and auth.userid equals user ID. In other words, we're checking to see if the user ID field is null, and then checking to see whether or not they need explicit authentication. Basically, that's what we're doing there. Two other things to note to end the session. We've got anon, which is a role, right, for unauthenticated users. Users are not logged into an application. And we have authenticated, which is an authenticated request. The user is logged in. Now, we talked about policies, right, and what they mean. But basically, this is what we're saying, right? We create policies. I also want to point out another level of authentication that we can use with MFA. So when we have the JWT, right, and we want to get rid of all those restrictions, what we can do is multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication is a good thing to do because essentially it enables us to slow down the attack. Now, there's no such thing as 100% security. There never will be. There never was. But we can slow down attackers by introducing things like multi-factor authentication. Because if we have an admin area, we don't want people getting into the admin area very, very easily, like changing a permalink, for example. We want it to be difficult. So Supabase provides something called MFA through the JWT, and the way that we can do that, right, is something like this, right? Create a policy, restrict updates on the profile, so, profile being inside of the table, right, as restrictive, and then we update and we say select auth.jwt to AAL, which is authentication, it's assurance level 2, right? So this is called the assurance levels. And then from there, we log in, basically. Here's another thing that we've got to be very careful about. Bypassing row-level security. So Supabase provides it, but it should never be used in a browser or exposed to customers. It specifically says that, right? Never be used in the browser or exposed to customers. So think API level, right? We don't necessarily want this in the API to say, right, here you go, bypass authentication. But it shows us how that can work, right? So you can create a new Postgres role which can bypass row-level security by using the bypass RLS privilege. We give it the privilege to do so. Now, it can be useful for system-level access, but you should never log in credentials for any Postgres role with the privilege. Never log in the role with the Postgres level privilege. Very, very interesting there. So, to sum up, RLS is very important for your application because it allows for authentication to happen at the database level layer. To mitigate, we can use specific schemas which are dependent on policies. When we have the policies defined, we can decide whether or not we want public or private data to be protected. We can use anon as the role, which will be assumed via the Supabase user auth. We can decide who is authenticated and non-authenticated based upon the policies themselves. We've also seen how to bypass RLS depending on what system-level operations we're doing. Yeah? So I hope that helps. I hope that helps the Vibe Code CEO, the people who are out there making the applications, vibe coding, all that kind of good stuff. And like I say, it's a synergy. It's a synergy between what we're building and what we're creating. Yeah? And what it means to us. But I think this has also helped the people in the software industry too, because I'm pretty sure there are people out there who have never heard of RLS before, right? So I hope it's helped you guys as well to see what's going on in the world of vibe coding and all that kind of stuff, which is going on now. I know that there are a lot of people inside of my feed saying, you know, we don't like vibe coding, we don't like all this stuff, they need to go back to fundamentals. I agree with you. But the thing is, the genie is out of the bottle. Right? AI is not going to go away tomorrow. We have to embrace AI. We have to embrace what's there. The thing is with the software engineers, we're in a unique position right now. Why? Because we know how the damn software works. We've been doing it for years. I know people in my channel who have been doing this thing for eons. Like the original OG people. Yeah? Not the Vibe Code kiddies. You guys are still learning this. I'm talking about the OGs, the guys who have been in the field for 15, 20 years, my friend. Yeah? So I hope that this has enlightened you in terms of what you need to be looking for inside of the LLM to ensure that your application is that little bit more secure. And if it's helped you in any way, I'm so glad, right? Thanks for sticking by and watching this entire video. I know it's been long. I know there's been a lot of information to unpack here. But I hope you come away learning something new, if it's RLS, or learning database level structures, right, which are associated to your application. And now you have the information and the knowledge to say, right, okay, this is the sort of thing I need to get my LLM to look at, right? You don't necessarily need to know everything about it, but you need the fundamental understanding that there are certain things which are important to what you need to serve your customers, because if you don't, right, GDPR becomes a factor, data protection becomes a factor, right? These are real problems that can make or sink your company. Now, if that's something that scares you, that's not a bad sign, but you may want somebody like me, for example, to have a look at the code and say, right, okay, well, is there anything else that I can do to secure my code? It really depends on what you're trying to do and achieve with your customers. So I hope that's been insightful, and I'm really curious to see what your thoughts are on here we go. See, I've been talking for 15 minutes now. So, So, about RLS, right? Like, what do you guys think to it? What do you guys suggest? Like, do you think that there's something which is better than RLS that we should be looking into? Maybe there's something that I've missed. I don't know, right? But if it resonates with you, you know, there's something that you've seen which, you know, maybe you disagree with, maybe you agree with, let me know in the comments below, right? And I'll be glad to help you. If you want more information about this sort of thing, comment down below, type in security, And I'll send you some more information about security in terms of vibe coded applications, because I'm here to help. All right, I'll see you in the next one.